Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, I don't think I've done a video from this channel yet, so it looks like it could be good. Subscribe, like, what began the Spanish Civil War? Interesting subject. How extremism scarred Spain. I don't know. So, I'm ready to learn. The 1920s and 1930s would have already been extremely significant, even if they weren't the precursor decades to World War II. And so I feel like they're kind of looked over because, you know, the 19-teens were so important and the 1940s obviously were so important. But a lot of stuff obviously happened in these decades. So let's go.
In July 1936, a secret cabal of Spanish generals and politicians attempted to topple Spain's government and install a military junta.
Is that Franco? I'm not sure. Love the Spanish flags.
They did not succeed, but the bid for power plunged Spanish society into all-out civil war. Vitriol and violence had already become commonplace in Spain, and now the extremes of the political left and right were done completely with competing for votes. After the generals botched their coup, hundreds of thousands flocked to join the military rebellion and were consolidated by Generalissimo Francisco Franco into the right-wing national cause. Their Republican opponents, supporters of the left-wing government, were equally determined to rally against enemies they despised. So, why? How did Spaniards or
commie fascist? Oh God, it worries me how little has changed.
So,
and by the way, I'm not going to mention the flags again. Maybe I will, but everyone needs to take notes from the Spanish flags, especially their choice of colors. The purple, the yellow, the red, all beautiful.
Why? How did Spaniards, or at least a critical mass of them, become so disillusioned with the good faith of their countrymen? What began the Spanish Civil War? Well, Spain by 1936 was a bit of a mess. Once high on New World silver, it had been the most powerful country on the planet, and the first to be called the empire on which the sun never sets. But by the turn of the 20th century, it had been reduced to a middling power, being relatively poor and agricultural compared to its European peers. Unlike them, Spain had managed to stay out of World War I, but most of the Spanish Empire had been lost in the previous century, and an attempt to build a new one in North Africa.
So Portugal was involved in World War I didn't really even know that.
Empire had been lost in the previous century, and an attempt to build a new one in North Africa led to humiliating defeat.
Sorry, I was just
its European peers. Unlike them, Spain had managed to stay out of World War I, but most of the Spanish Empire had been lost in the previous century, and an attempt to build a new one in North Africa led to humiliating defeat in the 1920s. That upended Spanish politics and heralded the start of a 7-year-long military dictatorship, which did conquer the Moroccan Rif. Headed by General Miguel Primo de Rivera and backed by Spain's King Alfonso XIII,
Okay, so going into Morocco, I've already learned something pretty cool that I didn't know about before.
El Primo de Rivera and backed by Spain's King Alfonso XIII, the dictatorship ruled the country, but it was popular in few quarters and came down amidst the Great Depression in 1930. His image tied to it, Alfonso abdicated the next year, and the Second Spanish Republic began, with the nation in a fragile state. The Republican Constitution gave Spain the most democratic regime it had ever had to that point, with provisions for freedom of speech and association and a universal right to vote, including, for the first time in Spain, women's suffrage. But it was far from perfect. Obviously, it devolved into civil war. The Republican government was structured similarly to neighboring France, and also to Weimar Germany. In the pre-war republic, Spaniards went to the polls to elect El Cortes, a parliament with about 400 seats.
Guys, it's strange to think how or it's a mystery. Well, let me phrase it as a question. Why is it that after centuries and centuries, if not millennia, that slavery was a constant thing, richer men being the ones who really are allowed to have any input in society, how did that all change in this avalanche in the 1800s and early 1900s to where you went from, slavery is a very popular thing and only certain people can run society, to now everyone should get the right to vote and women should get the right to vote and slavery should not be a thing anymore? My guess is that it has to do with the Industrial Revolution, but that begs a bigger question. What was it about the Industrial Revolution, if that is the cause, that allowed this stuff to happen? At some point, does society reach a certain level of comfortability? I know that the 1800s, early 1900s industrial times weren't perfect by any means, nor were they more equal. Well, in some ways. But I wonder if it's just when society reaches a certain level of stability that it can then think about other things to liberate that weren't on the mind before. I didn't phrase that greatly. I hope you understand my
In place of a king,
my question.
A president was head of state, and a cabinet led by a prime minister ran government departments. It was not a particularly stable system for a few reasons. Forget satisfying die-hard monarchists or communist revolutionaries. The new republic was undermined from the inside out when its own creators very quickly stopped getting along. In particular, Republicans from the moderate right felt betrayed when a constitutional convention approved measures that attacked the Catholic Church and gave the state broad powers to seize and redistribute private property. There was never a solid democratic majority to actually be elected. The country was splintered into too many camps, and it was much more complicated than just a left v right split.
Well, so it was kind of a failure from the start. Interesting.
The Spanish left included everyone
when I say it, I mean the Republican democratic system.
From just a left v right split. The Spanish left included everyone from middle-class liberals happy with the Republic to Marxists and anarchists out to topple state and society.
So it's interesting. It seems like a democratic Republican system is only viable when the society that is going to be given that system has already a certain amount of stability. Because if you just try to shove democratic and Republican ideals onto a society that isn't ready for it, it seems to just be doomed from the start, like this was.
Anyone who might
if I'm saying anything that's wrong, guys, please call me out for sure.
Marxists and anarchists out to topple state and society. Woe betide anyone who might get in their way. The left's most prominent figure was Manuel Azaña, a Republican liberal Democrat who headed several governments. Further left, the Spanish Socialists, the PSOE, closely aligned with the powerful UGT trade union, were led by Francisco Largo Caballero and Juan Negrin, while the Communist Party, controlled from Moscow, managed to incense the right but wasn't materially influential until the Civil War started. Then there was the largest union in Spain, the National Confederation of Labor, CNT. It professed anarchism and refused to recognize the
I immediately think of Cartoon Network. So the Spanish Civil War was sort of a proxy war between more communist and more nationalist governments.
Republic's Institute, CNT. It professed anarchism and refused to recognize the Republic's institutions at all. In that way, though,
it professed anarchism?
The National Confederation of Labor, CNT. It professed anarchism and refused to recognize the Republic.
I don't understand anarchism. It doesn't make any sense to me. If anarchism means the absence of a centralized government, isn't that an oxymoron? Because as soon as you have an anarchist state and you make one law, then that's a government. That's a central government. And therefore, you're not an anarchist state. Am I taking it too literally?
Republic's institution, CNT. It professed anarchism and refused to recognize the Republic's institutions at all. In that way, though for very different reasons, they were similar to plenty on the right, but make no mistake, it had strong Republican elements as well. Soon-to-be president Niceto Alcala Zamora, along with Azania, was instrumental in toppling the king, but as the Civil War crept closer, the Republican right was challenged. First of all, monarchism had not by any means been killed off, though its supporters were split between the royal families' Alphonsine and Carlist branches. Then, spurred on by the anti-Catholicism written into the Constitution, the conservative Catholic and expressly anti-Republican CEDA grew to be one of the most powerful parties in pre-war Spain. Led by José María Gil Robles, it became the largest single faction on the right. The CEDA...
I'm sorry I'm saying this again, but I just have to. The Spanish flags. If every country should just let Spain design their flag. Every one of the different flags within Spain are beautiful. I love them.
These fairly authoritarian Catholic corporatist principles brought much consternation to Republicans, and it sent the far left into hysterics. Likewise, radical rhetoric by the PSOE and radical action by their union allies only pushed conservatives towards their own extremes. All the while, the army top brass, which had not opposed the creation of the Republic but wasn't positively for it either, looked forlornly on. The Republican left, Republican right, and Socialist Republican coalition fell apart almost immediately at the end of 1931. For the next few years, across the country, workers would clash with capital and laborers with landowners. Secular reformers confronted traditional Catholics and the Church, while regional minorities in Galicia, the Basque Country, and Catalonia railed against the central government, demanding self-rule or outright independence. It wasn't war yet, but the UGT and CNT regularly brought cities and farms to a halt with devastating strikes.
Question, guys, isn't there even a kind of, I'm sure it's not as strong as it was, but isn't Catalonia even today like having some independent wishes?
Outright independence. It wasn't war yet, but the UGT and CNT regularly brought cities and farms to a halt with devastating strikes. More worryingly, they built armed paramilitary wings, which naturally met rightist militias. Among those was the fascistic Falange Española, the Spanish phalanx, organized by the firebrand son of the late dictator. Both the monarchist right and the revolutionary left would try and fail to overthrow the Republic before the 1936 nationalist plot. A year in, and Manuel Azania was prime minister at the head of a left-wing government. Unhappy about that, a band of army officers tried to take Madrid, and one briefly did hold Seville. Backed, though, by neither the rest of the army nor the civilian population, they were in custody, or off to Portugal, within about a day.
I was going to ask what's going on in Portugal at the time. Are they just sitting from the sidelines in a more stable government, just watching on here?
In 1933, President Alcala Zamora decided that the government wasn't functioning, which it wasn't, and called fresh parliamentary elections, making himself a pariah to the left. The right won power, but the largest group of delegates were not moderate Republicans of the president's breed. The CEDA had a plurality in parliament, and its leader, Gil Robles, expected the post of prime minister. He was denied it on account of his party's indifference towards maintaining democracy. Nevertheless, his conservatives were too popular to just ignore. 3 members of the CEDA were made ministers a year later, and the left called a general strike. In Asturias, that was developed into an armed uprising and a so-called proletarian revolution, supported by the Socialist Party and UGT and CNT militias, was declared. The government, backed by the army this time, put it down with extreme prejudice. The last pre-Civil War election, held in February 1936, returned a Cortes not too different in character from the one before it. Left-wing revolutionaries looked with disdain on their more moderate cousins, who squabbled with the center-right and Catholic conservatives and
Classic.
monarchists. They themselves didn't get on, and all had to contend with Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera's Falange movement hovering over their shoulder. The vote saw the left narrowly win back power, having formed an electoral alliance, the Popular Front. It was led by Azanya's moderates, but included the PSOE, as well as separatists and the Communist Party. At that point, General Franco, as the professional head of the army, urged the outgoing government to use force to prevent the leftists taking office. It didn't, and a new Azanya ministry took steps to demote and sideline officers, like Franco, whose loyalties were questionable. It should be noted, though, that a significant chunk of commanders and more among the rank and file were Republicans, and their releasing of military stockpiles to civilian militias in response to the nationalist coup in July was one of the reasons that the putschists could only split Spain, not seize it. The CEDA had again won the most seats of any right-wing party, but when Gil Robles began to call for a non-violent solution to Spain's woes, its members abandoned him in droves and the Falange exploded in size. The CEDA leader had in fact already refused to seize power when he was briefly war minister in 19...
When you have such opposing, relatively large groups on the either side, it's so terrible. Like, as soon as you try to be the logical, even, cool-headed man in the room, you just look like you're a danger that threatens one side's... You just look like, all right, now you're a weakness that could lead to the other side that we hate getting in charge. And at this point, I mean, what's the point? Like, it just seems like having a democratic, peaceful solution to this kind of tension is a fool's errand. And that is unfortunate and terrifying.
1935. For that, he was later decried as a traitor. The EDA leader had in fact already refused to seize power when he was briefly war minister in 1935. For that, he was later decried as a traitor in Francoist Spain. In April, the Popular Front government moved to oust the president, which was legal, if not necessarily clever. The removal of Alcalá Zamora, a centrist, was probably the moment that the right as a whole gave up on republicanism. Backed by large sections of the police, most clergy, landowners from stateholders to single-plot farmers, and plenty of the peasantry, the Falange, monarchist militias, and army commanders started actively planning for a coup. The three main military conspirators who intended to lead the revolt were Emilio Mola, who would soon command nationalist forces in mainland Spain, José Sanjurjo, who had been exiled in Portugal since the failed 1932 uprising, and to a lesser extent, Francisco Franco, who had been fired as chief of staff and effectively exiled with a posting on the Canary Islands. What they needed was a...
So if these are the Azores, this is the Canary Islands. What is this?
Exiled with a posting on the Canary Islands.
Is that Morocco's or?
What they needed was a spark, and they got one when Spain's foremost monarchist politician, José Calvo Sotelo, was murdered by a police officer with ties to the Socialist Party on July 13th. That was almost certainly not part of a plan. Socialist leadership didn't order it, and now President Azania was personally disgusted by the killing. But that wasn't the point. By the conspirators, the government could now be painted as incredibly inept at best, in addition to being a puppet for godless Marxists. They could be the forces of order who would save Spain from a red terror. For the soon-to-be Republican fighters, the nationalists were in fact a force for backwardness and merciless repression, and they were ready to be the freedom fighters who would save Spain from slavery and subjugation.
I mean, at this point, I would imagine the only sides to survive are going to be the brutal ones.
They would both get a scarred nation, but Spain survived its civil war. Not every country is so lucky. See, for example, the contentious coming together of Yugoslavia in the video to the left, and find out how its eventual doom was foreshadowed at the very beginning.
I feel like that Yugoslavia has much less history as a cohesive place compared to Spain. Let me know if I'm wrong there, but very interesting. The biggest thing that I thought of throughout this video, other than just learning what was being said, was that there seems to be a breaking point when two sides of one nation hate each other so much that, and you have enough of people on both sides that dislike each other, that democracy and democratic elections just won't work. Because for that to work, you need to respect the result if the other side wins. If it doesn't, then what's the point? Very interesting and kind of terrifying, to be honest. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below, any answers to my questions. You guys are always good with that. If I said something that you just think is wrong and you flat out disagree with, please let me know down in the comments. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate I'm repeating myself. Obviously, would love any comments. See you guys next time. Bye.